So I'd like to introduce our next speaker for this evening. The company is Izotropic Corporation, and speaking on their behalf is the company's president and CEO, Mr. Dr. John McGraw. John. That's your laser pointer if you should need it, sir.
Great.
Just hit the green button.
Great.
Timer's running.
Oh, great. Hi, thank you for coming out today. I'm Dr. John McGraw, CEO of Izotropic. We're a publicly traded company on the CSE under IZO and the OTCQB under IZOZF. Seeing as we're public, we have the typical disclaimer. I'm sure you have enough time to read that. Let's move on. So we're going to be talking about medical devices and specifically about breast imaging. And breast imaging is important because breast cancer is one of the most commonly diagnosed cancers, melanoma aside here. And we are the only publicly traded company that is developing a dedicated breast CT imaging device for the more accurate detection of breast cancer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this and why this is important, and I'm glad to see there's a number of women in this room that have experienced breast diagnosis, breast imaging through the current standard of care. So if you take a big step back, we all know cancer is a big issue in today's society, but the number one cost of all the cancers is breast cancer. And if you look at the cost of that in breast cancer, the number two cost in breast cancer is actually imaging. And that accounts for the second largest expenditure in the number one expenditure in cancer. So despite all of this money that's being spent, if we look at this, if we look backwards in terms of the treatment, we still have 280,000 new cases in the United States alone of breast cancer a year. Of that, 43,000 women die a year. And if we back up from that, we look at women get a biopsy prior to identification of a tumor, 70% of the biopsies are actually negative, indicating that the imaging before that or has been not very accurate. Well, how do we get there? Well, typically women today go through screening through a medical device, which I'll show you shortly. And if they see something through this screening procedure, then they go on to more imaging, more diagnostics, and usually about 3 to 12 images of that. If they see something, then they go into biopsy, and then treatment and monitoring. So this diagnostic part that leads to the 70% of inaccuracies of biopsies is really something we want to focus on, and we want to dramatically change and have a different user experience. So let's talk about the breast imaging market. Today, women go through breast imaging where they expose themselves, they put their technician handles their breasts, and they put them through a device that looks something like this, a mammography machine. And that mammography machine is really with the current standard of care, and I'll talk about that. I can't quite stress enough, and I'm sure women in this audience can attest to the uncomfortableness of this device and how painful it is. Actually, in some cases, and this machine is responsible for about 60% of the breast implant ruptures in the United States, to get an idea of the force involved here. So, how do we get here? What's the technology? Well, really, we start off with this thing called a mammography machine where they compress a breast into a pancake to take a two-dimensional image. And that came to the developments from the 60s to the 80s. In the 2000s, they made a digital mammography machine, so moving from film to digital mammography. And that was actually pioneered by a person in Toronto, Dr. Martin Yaffe, who's actually on our advisory board. And then it was just came out with a product called a digital tomosynthesis, where to try and get away from that two-dimensional view, which I'll explain in a second, they moved the device about 15 to 50 degrees to get better imaging accuracy, And one of the contributors to that technology, Dr. Tao Wu from Harvard, he's one of the co-inventors of that technology in Dan Copan's lab. He is also joined on our isotopic advisory board too. So, what is this technology? Really, it's taking a device to compress the breast, and you can kind of see right here where you have this breast that's compressed into a pancake to take this sort of two-dimensional image. But to try and get some depth and better imaging, they have this device here where it rocks the head back and forth and tries to get you a better image. And I'll show you that in a moment, what that looks like. It's a fairly large market. In the United States alone, it's about a $3.5 billion market selling these pieces of equipment. The older devices, these mammography devices here, sell for about $150,000 a piece. Life expectancy is about 8 years of the device. And then more recently, this tomosynthesis machine is about $350,000. So both the actual number of units being sold every year is increasing, as well as the average selling price is going up because they're shifting to these $350,000 units. So despite COVID, I think in the past couple of years and imaging going down, the amount of units continues to increase. So it doesn't matter what happens in the economy. Healthcare is an expenditure that keeps on moving and looking for better solutions. So this device, which I've talked about, really has a lot of challenges associated with it. There's a lot of force associated with it in terms of to create that two-dimensional or 2.5-dimensional image. The technician takes up to 12 views, takes a lot of time. Manipulating the breast, keep on compressing it. There is distortion with the image, so if you can imagine compressing a cone into a pancake, all the structures in between that get distorted, so it's really hard to tell where an item might be. And that compression inhibits a dye that we can use. I'm going to talk about that, contrast. And what that is there's two ways of sort of visualizing cancer. One is actually the image itself, and the other one is using something called contrast. And that's just a dye that goes in through blood vessels because cancer requires a lot of blood and energy. Blood vessels grow in it. So if you imagine putting a dye into an orange and then compressing that orange, the dye kind of goes everywhere. It doesn't really work as well. So it doesn't really work very well with mammography. And then, not surprisingly, a lot of women's breasts are different densities, different tissue makeup, and mammography has a lot of challenges visualizing women's breasts that are dense. And why is that? Well, a tumor is a lot of growing tissue, rapidly growing, requires a lot of blood vessels to give that tumor energy to have those cells divide. Well, the more dense that tumor is, it blends in with the higher density of breasts that in a high dense breast tissue. So tissue density in the breast changes over time. Younger women typically have more denser breasts. Some ethnicities have denser breasts. So it's kind of a double whammy with dense breasts. It's harder to see, but when you do have a tumor, it's usually more aggressive. So it's important to visualize that, and so we have some technology to help with that. So in that machine there, the challenge too is a woman's got to stand up and hold her breath and get up to 12 images. Each image might take between 10 and 30 seconds. So under enough force that could rupture a breast implant. So we have a different solution. This is what we have. We call it IsoView. It's actually the 5th generation device. The 4 previous generations were developed at UC Davis for about $20 million of NIH funding. Over 600 patients have been through those previous generation devices. And so this is a table at which a woman gets up on the table herself. She puts her own breast into a cup. It hangs freely. And instead of taking like 12 images, this takes 500 images in 10 seconds. And so this is a dedicated CT machine, and only the breast is exposed to radiation, not the rest of the woman's body. So this improves workflow, has a lot of benefits. But how do you take these 500 images And then we can, using artificial intelligence and machine learning, combine those into one image, essentially, to get a full, true three-dimensional view. And we've partnered with Johns Hopkins University, one of the world experts in image reconstruction, to create these images. Now, we think this is a pretty good idea. There's a lot of women, every woman I've spoken to thinks this is a pretty good idea. The leading radiology website in the United States and subsequently the world, called AmpMini.com. It's a very funny name for a website for radiology, but it's an inside joke for radiologists. Why it's called that. They awarded us in September of 2021 as the second best up-and-coming device, and we hadn't yet fully released what our device will look like. So what do these images look like? Well, on the far left is that two-dimensional mammography image, and these are all the same breasts. This is exactly the same breast taken with different modalities. In the center one is that tomosynthesis, where they try and get better image quality by looking at the depth of the tumor. And so this is a breast. You can kind of see some dark spots. And then IsoView, where it says true 3D, that's what the breast looks like in the blood vessels with the image contrast agent. And hopefully you can see those two tumors right here. And if you go try and look for them over here, and over here, those are the same spots. And this is what a single slice may look like as well under that. But what we can do here is, I mentioned this takes 10 seconds and 500 images, but I'm going to show you just what this looks like when you rotate it. And so the advantage is you can now see behind objects that were formerly squished or behind each other. You can see them. Now, when I show this to radiologists, they think this is fantastic. They actually say these tumors light up like a Christmas tree. That's so easy to see. When I show this to oncologists, they're very excited because now they can measure the volume of those tumors. And why is that important? Well, they can give a therapy and very quickly, within a month or less, determine if that volume is changing, getting bigger or smaller. I showed this to a plastic surgeon. She was very excited about this because this is like the first time they'd be able to do surgical treatment planning with their general surgeon when they're doing mastectomy or partial mastectomy, and they do reconstruction afterwards. Now, that could be for the difference between nipple sparing or non-nipple sparing partial mastectomy in many cases. And what's really important when you're doing surgery is blood flow and to map where you're going to go around these blood vessels. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that a little later, about my background and how I know a little bit about these areas. Now, what a radiologist views, this is what a typical radiologist would view in 3 planes. This is typical CT imaging. It's not anything new for them. This is something they would see with their whole body CT. And so we would have a viewer that's very similar to something that they're very familiar with and they know how to use. Now, just some data. There's a lot of lines on this, but what I'm going to point out to you is, and this is my only graph for you, is on the bottom here is the lesion size. So this would be what would be representative of a tumor size in millimeters. And on the y-axis is what we call observer performance, where to determine, radiologist looks at this and determines if that's a tumor or not very quickly. And we had 3 radiologists and we averaged them out. And when the blue lines here, we had a computer model do this, and the red lines are actually radiologists. And what we find is when tumors are big, it's pretty easy to see tumors no matter what. Whether you have, and this is without contrast. This is without that special enhancement. That's just breast CT imaging against the standard of care. But when they're small, we see that we can significantly see tumors better. And so that gives us really a lot of confidence. What we're building is going to be improving the standard of care, and when we add contrast, it's going to be even better. So in summary, what's important here is there's no force applied to the woman's breast. There's no compression. We have all these 500 views in 10 seconds. And we're able to visualize tumors very well. There's no distortion. And we can see dense breasts very well, and we can calculate that density. So the standard of care of mammography and tomosynthesis, what I've talked about, or ultrasound, which usually follows mammography, or even an MRI, we have a lot of aspects that achieve what the standard of care would be. But if you really want to get true three-dimensional imaging, you have to move to an MRI. And those are very expensive, $2 to $4 million. It's very hard to get into an MRI if you've ever tried to get time. And especially if you're a woman, to get breast imaging, you'd have to get an all-female tech group. So it's very difficult to do that sometimes. So we're positioning our device to have better image quality than tomosynthesis, the standard of care in mammography, but around a similar price point. We have intellectual property, we have patents filed, we've licensed from the University of California, Davis. We have global rights to that. We continue to file our own IP. We have, we're really building here though a platform. And as I mentioned, a woman, when she comes in, she goes through screening for initial, if they see something, they go for diagnostic workup, then they have a biopsy and treatment. We want to be a part of every aspect of breast cancer detection and care. We're initially starting off with a clinical trial here to focus on diagnostic workup of the breast with contrast. We're going to be building accessory devices like a biopsy device. We're going to be building new software modules for, I mentioned, surgical treatment planning, and also tumor volume analysis. And why that's important is how our sales model is. We're going to have one-time payments for the devices, for the accessories. We're going to have subscription models for the different types of software. And we may even have rental use as well for those groups that are looking to acquire the device but not have the upfront capital costs. So the technology itself we're in a large growing market, over $3.5 billion market in the US. There's lots of demand. Every woman I speak to, I ask her one question, and you can do the same if you're looking at this technology, is how far would you drive past where you get mammography today? Would you want a device like this? And most women I talk to say 2 hours. So I imagine a 2-hour radius around any imaging clinic, and you can see all the different clinics there, and there's tremendous demand for that. We have partnerships with some of Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, one of the leading academic radiology centers in the United States and in the world. And we have multiple revenue streams that we anticipate. We have an increasing number of indications for use. And how we're going to get there is we have a number of events that are going to be coming up, which I'll talk about, in terms of we're in the process of developing our device this year, and this year we intend to get into a clinical trial so that favoring a positive outcome of that trial will get market authorization in the United States to sell this device. So who's going to do all this stuff? Well, let me tell you a bit about myself. You've heard about the technology. My background, I actually have a master's PhD in neuroscience. I started a medical device company in grad school on the side, which ended up that technology getting acquired by Smith & Nephew, sold throughout the world. I've actually done a lot of drug development, especially in breast cancer and a number of other cancers. I was an executive at a public company called CML Healthcare in Canada, Canada's largest imaging provider and laboratory diagnostics provider. We got acquired for $1.2 billion by private equity and merged with another laboratory company, and I was there for a while. I left that and joined another company called Novadac, a medical imaging company that one of the indications was for breast reconstruction post-mastectomy. I was a senior executive there, leading global operations. We got acquired by Stryker, Stryker's fourth largest acquisition at $800 million. And then I joined this company, Izotropic, another medical imaging company. Dr. John Boone is from UC Davis. He's the founder of the technology. He's been working on this for over 20 years. He's an editor in the leading journal in this space and sets the standards for radiation safety. Dr. Yunus Ashkir is an engineer that just finished from concept to market a head and neck cancer radiation therapy device that weighs 2 tons. Completely self-shielded. He's left that and he's joined the lead of our engineering team. So we have a team that has tremendous experience in the medical physics and breast cancer space. Our medical advisors, Dr. Karen Linfors, she helped set the standards for breast screening in the United States. And Dr. Shadi Shakiri just recently joined us as the leading radiologist at UC Davis, who's run clinical trials in breast cancer imaging, and specifically the 600 patients that had run breast CT imaging before. As I mentioned, some highlights, not all of our scientific advisory board, but Dr. Martin Yaffe and Dr. Tao Wu are some of the originators of the technology that is the standard of care today. And our company itself, we went public in 2018, a very small raise of $1 million to license the technology from UC Davis. We've raised about $12 million in financing to date, so the amount of money that's gone into this project has been about $30 million total. We have recently there's been the billing code's been awarded in the United States for breast CT imaging. We've announced partnerships in artificial intelligence with Johns Hopkins, as I mentioned. We've built part of our device. We've had it certified for the key parts for radiations and radiation emissions, which is a huge milestone for us. And then what's happening going forward? Well, we're assembling the device right now. We're assembling the device to get certified. We're going to build our clinical units. We're going to announce where our clinical sites are and enter clinical trials this year. These are all huge material events that are going to be happening this year as we transition from a preclinical company to a clinical company. So we're going to have, I think, a lot of news coming out this year, very material news, and I look forward to communicating that more in the future. We are currently at about a $30 million market cap, and we have about 60 million shares fully diluted and about 45 million shares outstanding. I welcome any questions if we have time. That might be in time. Thank you very much. Yes. Sorry, can you? So what are we waiting for therapy, or? Right. So what 3D our imaging will enable physicians to do is to better visualize the tumor. Now, a paper just recently came out this year that really characterized the different types of tumors and their morphology, how they look, and they haven't really been able to do that well historically because of mammography squishes the breast. So with this 3D imaging, they may have better ideas around treatment planning, giving you providing a therapy, and then being able to see how that tumor is responding to therapy a lot sooner. So adjusting how the treatment course or what therapeutic approaches they may take. So I can't discuss therapeutic approaches because we're more of a diagnostic approach, but I'm happy to talk to you more after if that's helpful. Yes, ma'am.
But, okay. Thanks, Eric. As I was reading the information, it could see something malignant, but not the benign one. So I was just wondering, because once you put the breast in it looked like a little hole or something. It went in, and you were able to do the imaging, the circular,
Mm-hmm.
the round. As far as if they see something that may be benign, are they able to diagnose it at that point that it is benign, or it doesn't have the capability to do that?
That's a great question. So typically right now, a lot of when radiologists see a shadow or they see an image, they just let's go biopsy. And 70% of the time, it's negative. And that's a traumatic, it's a $3,500 procedure. Or they say, let's wait, see if it grows. Or they say, let's give you ultrasound to see if it's a mass versus a lesion. So with this approach, many of those approaches don't need to be taken anymore because you'll be able to see that it's a mass versus a lesion. The other thing is we see these things called microcalcifications. And microcalcifications are associated with tumor tumors. And so what we found is that with this technology, microcalcifications show up that are malignant, both in our device but also in the mammography machine. But in our device, they don't really show up when they're benign. It's hard to see them when they're benign. Whereas mammography, they just fluoresces, they can't differentiate. So we seem to be able to differentiate better between benign and malignancy than other modalities. And the experience with Dr. Shadi Shakiri is that she's like, once I've got a breast CT with contrast, I don't need to do any other imaging, you know. And I think a more recent example has been with vaccines. Is sometimes a COVID vaccine instigates an inflammatory reaction in part of the breast, in the lymph, and so doctors start getting confused. At the radiologists, we're like, oh, maybe we should watch that. Maybe that's something. And with this, we'd be able to tell right away. Right. Now, I'm not saying don't get a vaccine. I'm just saying that these are the things you have to be aware about.
Are the little mass things, are those tumors?
Yeah, those are
Okay.
2 tumors. Great.
So if something shows up, that means it's something there, because if it's benign, it's just mass.
If something shows up, then it's recommended you would get a biopsy to confirm.
Okay.
I think there was a question right here, too. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Do you have just a ballpark idea what you're going to charge for it? I saw it wasn't finalized yet, but I mean, you're talking $1 million, $5 million per unit. Do you have any kind of an idea yet?
Yeah, I do. It's probably going to be in that $600,000 to $700,000
Oh, okay.
range.
Great.
And that seems to be a good spot for us. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I have a question on the patents and the relationship to the gentleman that works for UC Davis. Does your company own the patents, or does he own them?
The university owns them. We have an exclusive license to them.
Okay.
We are developing our own patents as well, and Dr. John Boone is also involved with the company, and he's regularly involved in our development plans.
So probably not a lot of risk of the university licensing this to other companies.
But there's zero risk. Well, nothing zero, but they're very much focused on us bringing this to market with them. Thank you.
Am I to understand there's one prototype in existence?
So there's one 4th generation prototype. We're developing the 5th, and we're assembling that right now. Yeah.
And is there going to be a testing period
So
involving those?
yeah, so what happens is we're going to assemble it, we're going to test it, and we have what we call phantoms, so fake breasts, that we test these out on, as well as human ones, and then we'll move into production and to move those into the clinic. Yes. Now, I know we're probably running short of time, and so I'm happy to take questions afterwards, and I'm here all day tomorrow as well. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.